This is lesson 11 in our series on the story of Joseph. We'll be in Genesis chapter 45 and 46, the big reveal and the reversal of grace. This lesson will actually cover nearly 2 chapters of Joseph's story, but first, you'll remember back in chapter 43, Joseph hosted a meal for his estranged brothers where he intentionally favored the youngest with a portion 5 times as large to see how comfortable are they with grace. That the person in charge has the freedom to favor whomever he wants to and with however much he wants to give them. Chapter 43 ends, they feasted and drank freely with him. This is powerful. It shows that his brothers are starting to get it, but Joseph still doesn't reveal himself to them. Instead, in chapter 44, he conducts what I called a final test for peace. He creatively puts them in the exact same situation they were in when they had sold him into slavery. The very next morning, not long after they leave, Joseph sends his steward to catch up to them. His brothers, of course, have no idea that the night before, Joseph had instructed his steward to put his silver cup in Benjamin's sack to make it look like he stole it. The critical question before them, when this is discovered, will they abandon Benjamin like they had abandoned Joseph? Remarkably, they don't. They gather their belongings, return to Egypt, showing they care more about their brother and their father than they do about themselves. This moment confirms their transformation, but it also triggers Joseph's revelation, which will ultimately reconcile their entire family. But first, Joseph questions them, and it's Judah who steps up to save the family by giving a passionate speech in which he declares his willingness to sacrifice himself for the family. And this is the straw that breaks Joseph down. What follows is one of the most emotional scenes in all the Bible. Chapter 45 begins, Joseph could no longer control himself. He dismisses everyone from the room except his brothers. He becomes so emotional, he weeps so loudly that the Egyptians in Pharaoh's house hear him. Then in verse 3, we reach the climactic moment of his story as he proclaims to his brothers, I am Joseph. His brothers don't say a word. They can't say a word. Come close to me, he continues. I'm your brother, the one you sold into Egypt. Do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Now skip down to verse 7, and he repeats himself. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Clearly, the point, he says it 3 times, God sent me here. God sent me here. God sent me here. Can you say that? Can you say that about your place of suffering? God sent me here. As you consider how others have sinned against you in your life, can you say, God did this? I don't know the particulars of your story. I only know my own. But are you able, by God's grace, to say, God sent me here. God did this for my good and for his glory. In the verses that follow, Joseph tells them, 1, God has made him Lord of Egypt. 2, he will provide a place for them to live. And 3, they must return and tell their father. Then, in a scene of out-of-control emotion, Joseph throws his arms around Benjamin and weeps as Benjamin holds him. He keeps crying as he kisses each one of his brothers, and they still, of course, can't utter a word. Have you ever been so wildly forgiven that it leaves you speechless? Then verse 15 provides the final word in this most significant scene in the entire story, which is why it's so strange and easy to miss. I think the narrator intends to catch us off guard, because of how mundane he makes the ending. After that, after all that, his brothers talked with him. All this emotion climaxes in a conversation? Precisely. Because what could be more beautiful than this particular group of brothers just hanging out and talking with each other? Go all the way back to Genesis 37 where their story began. Joseph never talked with his brothers. He either talked about them to his father or he talked to them about how much more his father loved him and how one day they would even worship him. But now he is talking with them. You see, the preposition has changed, and this is crucial because his brothers never talked with him either. They also either talked to him, and when they did, it was to question him and his crazy dreams, or they talked about him with each other, and in particular, what they wanted to do against him, and then did do against him. They related to him the same way he related to them. But now everything has changed. Their relationship has been transformed. They talk with each other. There is no more powerful statement of grace, no more marvelous way to display this particular family's reconciliation than the simple yet profound, his brothers talked with him. All has been reconciled as they engage in a conversation, doing what brothers should do all the time, which is to talk with each other, not about each other, not against each other, not even to each other, but with each other. You know, reconciliation is taking place in the church when we talk with each other, not about each other, definitely not against each other, but not even to each other, but with each other. As beautiful as this scene is, we need to keep going all the way through verse 30 of the next chapter, a large portion of which is the genealogy of Jacob's family. It's found in verses 8 to 27 of chapter 46. We won't read it, but it is very significant as we learn that each member of God's covenant family travels to Egypt just as Joseph commanded them to do. In other words, he's clearly in charge. He's orchestrated their reconciliation by getting them all to Egypt. And yet, standing even more powerfully in the background is God himself, who sovereignly authored the transformative process in Joseph's life that their family's reconciliation required. Joseph goes from the son the family rejected to now the son the family depends on, which sounds very familiar to someone else. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Jesus is our greater Joseph, the son we rejected, but now depend on for everything. I believe reconciliation is the ultimate reversal of grace. Can you imagine playing Joseph's part in this story? Can you imagine caring so deeply for the people who sinned against you that you not only rescue them, but also provide for them, and to the extent that they are dependent upon you for their very livelihood? That's what happens in Joseph's story. His entire family becomes completely dependent upon him, and that is what Jesus has done for us. He's rescued us. He's provided for us. He's fully forgiven us, reconciled us to himself to the extent that we are now completely dependent upon him, which also means that if we claim to be his followers, we are now called to do this for each other, to rescue, to provide, to forgive, to reconcile, that we might become the kind of family that genuinely depends on one another. This, I believe, is the definition of community: a forgiven and forgiving people, a reconciled and reconciling people who cannot live without each other. For the rest of this lesson, we're going to explore 3 marks of this kind of community: hospitality, reassurance, and reunion. In verses 16 to 20 of chapter 45, Pharaoh hears that Joseph's brothers have come to Egypt. He sends word to Joseph to tell them, go back to Canaan, get their families, all their belongings, and return to Egypt, where he will give them the very best Egypt has to offer. But like most people in charge, after Pharaoh announces this plan, someone else has to do all the work. That's Joseph. He takes care of all the details in verses 21 to 24. And curiously, here Joseph favors Benjamin again. This time he gives him more provisions for the journey than he gives his brothers. This can only be to ensure that they're continuing to fall in line with grace. His parting advice to them as they head home is also telling. Don't quarrel on the way, he says. One of the most obvious fruits in a forgiving and reconciling community is a lack of quarreling. Once again, Joseph's story calls us to talk with, not quarrel with one another. But the main highlight here in this section is how Pharaoh and Joseph show hospitality to Joseph's family. This is the operative word, hospitality. Bruce Waltke writes, hospitality is not entertaining. Hospitality is being food and drink for one another. Hospitality is rescuing and providing. Pharaoh and Joseph rescue God's family from the famine. They provide for their every need. Hospitality is not inviting your family and friends over to grill out and play tailgate games. There's a whole lot more sacrifice involved in the biblical vision of hospitality. Many years ago, an 80-year-old friend of mine that I had gotten to know told me she was moving because her daughter and her husband had built an addition onto their house so that she could move in and live with them until she dies. That's hospitality. Hospitality requires a much greater sacrifice than entertaining. And this kind of hospitality is the first mark of a forgiving and reconciling community, rescue and provision, not just entertaining. The second mark is reassurance. In verses 25 to 28, the scene shifts to Canaan as Joseph's brothers tell their father the jaw-dropping news that Joseph is alive. And not only is he alive, but he's the ruler of Egypt. And he's invited them all to come to Egypt so that he can save them from the famine. Jacob is stunned. But when he sees all the provisions that Joseph has sent, his spirit is revived and he declares, I'm convinced. My son Joseph is still alive. I'll go and see him before I die. His sons, of course, can't prove any of this. All they can do is reassure him that the shocking news they came home with is in fact true. A forgiving and reconciling community is always reassuring each other. But the most reassuring thing is the commitment that God himself has to be with the community, even as they reassure one another. That's what we see in the next scene, beginning in chapter 49, verses 1 to 7. Jacob journeys to Egypt with his entire family, and along the way, God appears to him at Beersheba, which may ring a bell if you know Genesis. Beersheba is where Abraham planted a tree, Isaac built an altar, and both called on the name of the Lord. The narrator's point is that Jacob worships the same God as his fathers. And it's here at Beersheba that God reassures Jacob he has no reason to be afraid. For it is in Egypt, of all places, that he will make them into a great nation. The most comforting thing, God says, is I myself will go down there with you. There is no greater assurance than the reassurance that God is with you. Are you experiencing his presence in your life? That no matter what happens, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, God is with you. When Jesus ascended to heaven, he reassured his followers with the same promise he makes to us today. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. But friends, neither of these marks, not the rescue and provision of hospitality, nor the comfort and presence of reassurance, is as meaningful as the reality of being reunited with a son that you thought was dead. The final mark of a forgiving and reconciling community is reunion. There are two very emotional scenes in this part of the story. The first is a promise, and the second is the fulfillment of that promise. Together they show the unspeakable beauty of reunion. The first, the promise, occurs in Genesis 45, 25 to 28, which I know we've already looked at, but we need to return to briefly. This is when Joseph's brothers arrive in Canaan and tell their dad what he could have never imagined, that Joseph is alive. So let's try. Let's try to imagine being Jacob. You're waiting and waiting and waiting for your sons to come back home. And your greatest fear is that they all won't make it back, especially Benjamin. They arrive, and you're filled with joy as you can count them all. Everyone is accounted for. And then I imagine them asking Jacob to sit down. Sit down, Dad. We've got something more to tell you. Joseph is still alive. A different translation captures Jacob's response perfectly. His heart became numb. Have you ever received news so good that your heart goes numb? News so amazing that you actually can't believe it's true because you can't imagine what your life would be like if it really was true? The cancer is gone. You're pregnant. You are not guilty. You're hired. Will you marry me? You are a citizen of the United States of America. The second scene, as emotional as that one is the fulfillment of the promise that Joseph is in fact still alive. It occurs later in Genesis 46 when Jacob sees Joseph with his own eyes. And verse 29 records that as soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Joseph just keeps on weeping. Jacob then says to Joseph, and I'm sure he was weeping all over himself too, even though the text doesn't say it, "Now I'm ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. I want you to do something for me. I actually want you to close your eyes and imagine. I want you not to imagine this scene, but imagine something that in your wildest dreams you could never believe would actually come true." Are you thinking of something? Imagine what it would feel like if whatever you're thinking about actually came true. Imagine news so good that your heart goes numb. Imagine news so good that you'd weep your eyes out. Imagine news so good that you could die right now and be at peace. I do not know the specifics of what you imagined, but I bet you imagined something wrong made right. Perhaps a broken relationship made whole. I bet you imagined pain of some kind going away, or sorrow of some variety transforming itself miraculously into joy, loss overcome, hope restored, despair driven away, victory over a struggle you've had for years. Perhaps your imagination gravitated to reconciliation, to forgiveness, to peace with someone in particular from your past. Maybe perhaps even God himself. Because when our relationships aren't right, we aren't right. But when our relationships are good and whole, we are so very good and whole. Our greatest longing, the best news that we can possibly imagine, is for whatever's wrong in our lives to be made right. It's planted deep within your soul, a desire for everything to be made new. Joseph's story is so beautiful because it keeps calling out to us that with God, whatever is so dreadfully wrong can be made so beautifully right. That one day all the hurt really will pass away. All the sad things will come untrue. Sorrow will turn to joy. Loss will be lost forever. Hope will be restored, and despair will be dealt a decisive, fatal blow. Jesus will one day proclaim, I am making all things new. I don't know when this will happen, but I trust that it will. I don't know what it will look like when it does, but I can't wait to see it. I don't know how all the particulars will play out, but I so look forward to having it figured out for me. One day our hearts will go numb. Our eyes will gush tears of joy, and our death will give way to life. Sin will be no more, and we will live forever in the place we've always longed for as the people we've always longed to be. It'll be a place of hospitality where God, the rescuer and provider, welcomes us with open arms, and we gladly depend on him. It will be a place of eternal reassurance where God is always present with us to comfort us and protect us. And it will be a place of blessed reunion where we are finally able to be the people he has called us to be, where we will finally live up to our name, the body of Jesus Christ. Amen.